Good morning. Shortly after I was appointed director of the National Museum of the American Indian in 1990, my boss, the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Robert McCormick Adams, made the following rather bold declaration about the future of this then nascent institution. "This is a national museum," he said, "that takes the permanence, the authenticity, the vitality, and the self-determination of Native American voices as the fundamental reality it must represent. We move decisively from the older image of the museum as a temple with its superior self-governing priesthood to a forum, committed not to the promulgation of received wisdom, but to the encouragement of a multicultural dialogue." As the novitiate director I then was, this expression of institutional intention at the NMAI's beginnings was comforting and reassuring, and I was forever grateful. But in the way that only my beloved sister and fellow citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, Suzan Harjo, can, always steeped in nuanced accuracy, told me in a kindly way that my statement was not entirely accurate. And indeed, the roots of the hallowed halls in which we now gather are deeper in time and are profoundly native in origin. As she writes in her essay entitled "It Began with a Vision of a Sacred Place," which appeared in the NMAI editions volume Past, Present, and Future, Challenges of the National Museum of the American Indian, she wrote, "The National Museum of the American Indian began with a vision in a sacred place, an image born to Native people of venerable cultural continua who applied ancient wisdom, traditional knowledge, and modern experience to a disturbing problem. The wisdom is the legacy of the Sisistas, Lakota, and other Native peoples. The place and time, Bear Butte, June 1967, a date you've heard before this morning. On that day and on those holy grounds, especially so for the Sisistas, 4 days of talk centered on problems and solutions in 4 areas, the third of which was, quote, museum reform, our cultural center, or a new way, and we can do it right, close quote. My life has been characterized by a focus on points and places of social, cultural, legal, and political engagement, whether in conflict or compatibility, because that interface is where history is made and created. The National Museum of the American Indian and its beginnings are precisely such a time and place for me, and I believe for Suzan. This presentation addresses that convergence, and I would like to organize it as follows. First, I want to describe the what of beginning intentions at the NMAI that motivated young staff and institution working in largely uncharted territory, and the charter trustees like Suzan, whose bold and courageous policy decisions guided them. Second, and perhaps even more important, I will address the why of that what, whence the roots of the institution's vision and its subsequent departures from the conventionalities of 19th and 20th century museums in the United States. Third, I want to highlight, briefly because of time constraints, aspects of the mission statement that speak to the essential and very special relationship between the NMAI and contemporary Native communities. Finally, I will conclude by sliding ever so slightly into the macro by talking about the impact of all of the foregoing on the very nature, function, and future of 21st century museums, including this one, museology and museum practice. Let's turn first to the what of the NMAI strategic intentions and interpretive approach at birth. And where else to begin but the museum's first mission statement, in which Suzan was deeply involved in developed by the staff and the rest of the Board of Trustees. Here is how it read. The National Museum of the American Indian shall recognize and affirm to Native communities and the non-Native public the historical and contemporary cultural achievements of the Native peoples of the Western Hemisphere by advancing, in consultation, collaboration, and cooperation with Native people, knowledge and understanding of Native cultures, including art, history, and language, and by recognizing the museum's special responsibility through innovative public programming, research, and collections to protect, support, and enhance the development, maintenance, and perpetuation of Native culture and community. I cannot leave the subject of the founding mission statement, however, without one sidebar disclosure. I confess that the precise words were largely of my doing at the time. Upon reading them, one of my more irreverent but revered colleagues at the Smithsonian wryly and dryly observed, "Wow, it must have been some job translating an 84-word single sentence from High German into English." Professor Claire Smith, whose highly collaborative work and scholarship focused on indigenous communities of Australia, described the NMAI as follows when it opened on the National Mall 15 years ago, come tomorrow. The empowerment of new voices also can involve a diminution of the authority of established voices by widening the concept of authority to include the voices of indigenous peoples, many of whom have been silenced too long. The NMAI, either intentionally or inadvertently, challenges the position of non-indigenous peoples as authorities on indigenous cultures. The invocation of Native voices was by no means inadvertent, I can promise you, and indeed was quite intentional. For the better part of a century, the defining interpretive voice had been in the third person rather than the first. But to Secretary Adams' point, authentic and authoritative cultural knowledge also sits in places external to the temple on the hill. For the museum, the mission statement's reference to, quote, collaborations, consultation, and cooperation, close quote, encompasses far more than Native peoples as colonized informants. All of the NMAI's initial board policies, in which Suzan herself took a lead role, relating to exhibitions, research, and publications, enunciated that approach and honored those ethics. Second, as indicated previously, I want to articulate the why of the NMAI's inclusion of Native voice in interpretation and representation. The intellectual and curatorial rationale in museums is straightforward, and thus surprising for having been understated or misstated for so long. And it is this: on a global basis, including Native America, cultural knowledge systems are highly differentiated. Although museums historically grew up in Europe and were thus based on Western knowledge systems and disciplines, not all world cultures descend from the European Enlightenment and Western rationalism, with its structured and almost rigid binary division between nature and culture, one or the other, but never both, and never viewed as whole. As then NMAI staff and now tenured university history professor Jacqueline Rand observed in describing the conceptual and lived interconnectedness and wholeness of Native art, history, and culture, she wrote, "The Native artist values the creation of art over the final product. Process speaks to historical or cultural significance because it is testimony to cultural continuity and change. It is the evidence of lost traditions, innovations, preserved cultural knowledge, historic perspective, and vision of the future. It takes into account a sort of spiritual evidence that is integral to the creative process. The integrity of the creative process is foremost. The object is meaningless without it." A second example. In label copy he wrote personally decades ago for the Millicent Rogers Museum in Taos, New Mexico, the late Popovide, one of the most distinguished of 20th century Native ceramicists, gave specificity, community context, and authenticity to Professor Rand's general description. The label copy read this way: "We do what comes from thinking, and sometimes hours and even days are spent to create an aesthetic scroll in design. Our symbols and our representations are all expressed as an endless cadence and beautifully organized in our art as well as in our dance. There is design in living things, their shapes, forms, the ability to live, all have meaning. Our values are indwelling and dependent upon time and space unmeasured. This in itself is beauty. Contemporary Native artists in the United States frequently have affirmed Popovi Day's poetic description of the integration of art, history, tradition, and spirituality in a holistic manner. In consultations hosted by the NMAI during the early 1990s, Rick Hill, a Native artist, former museum director, and scholar, stated that, quote, "The main difference between Indian and non-Indian artists is that we are still community-driven. Art is the cement that binds the Indian peoples together, uniting us with our ancestors and with generations yet to be born," close quote. For Hill, the relationship of Native art to indigenous culture is direct and patent. Through art, he said, we can take a look at why language is important, why ritual is important, why land is important. Bob Houses, a renowned contemporary Native artist in the United States and son of the equally famous Allan Houser, puts the matter even more pointedly. "I want to see people participating in my work. That's totally contrary to what we're taught in America, the artist as an individual, the genius. I don't want to see any of that in my work. I'd rather see at most a cultural reflection of being an Apache. I've been fighting those concepts of individualness, uniqueness, and universalism, concepts that are totally contrary to tribalism. Individualism denies a future or a past awareness. You claim it, you own it, but you're not part of it." And now to my third point to be discussed briefly, namely, that specific part of the NMAI's original mission statement that referenced, quote, "recognizing the museum's special responsibility through innovative public programming, research, and collections to protect, support, and enhance the development, maintenance, and perpetuation of Native culture and community." This strategic aim sat very close to the heart and soul of the National Museum of the American Indian and its earliest strategic aspirations. Its roots were ethical and moral, an arts and culture institution that holds the cultural patrimony of living Native peoples has a profound responsibility to use and deploy its human and cultural assets in support of the cultural continuance and survivance of contemporary and living Native communities. These ethics and morality were applied and practiced in a variety of ways at the NMAI. As discussed by others here today, a robust repatriation program, of course, was assumed, and that subject was the first to be addressed through the adoption and of formal policies established by the Board of Trustees, with Suzan in a leadership role. In loaning collections, the museum also paid proactive attention to requests received from tribal museums and cultural centers, and internship programs were focused explicitly on training Native peoples for service to those institutions. The NMAI's collection staff actively solicited the counsel and advice of tribal representatives in developing and establishing care and conservation protocols. One of the museum's 4 major operating divisions was the Department of Community and Constituent Services for the purpose of maintaining and sustaining a vibrant and meaningful relationship on a daily basis with contemporary Native communities. We considered, which is implicit in the department's name, Native peoples to be constituents and not only audiences of the institution. Both were important to the NMAI, but the former were the paramount stakeholders. It was this strategic positioning in the end that made the NMAI unique among Native institutions, a museum different in actual fact. So there you have in short script the 3 strategic pillars of the NMAI in its infancy: the fearless and unapologetic invocation of first-person Native voice, the associated transformation of museum curation and interpretive methodology, and the assumption of a definitive and empowering role in directing and supporting cultural continuance and survivance in contemporary Native communities through their access to and use of the cultural and human assets of the NMAI. And now the final question I posed at the outset of this presentation about the beginnings of the National Museum of the American Indian at the Smithsonian. What is the impact of the museum practices I have just described on the fundamental nature of this special place on the National Mall that we call a museum? And for that matter, and more universally, what is the legacy for the broader museum community in the 21st century? The popular perception of these great institutions called museums historically is that they are principally cultural destinations and houses of beautiful and significant objects. But at the same time, they somehow ultimately sit apart from society's mainstream, kind of over there, instead of thoroughly interconnected and integrated into the communities they serve. But they can and perhaps should be more than that in the 21st century. The substantial changes that have occurred in the interpretive practices of museums is significant. The inclusion of additional legitimate and authoritative voices to the museum's table of conversation and representation is potentially transformative. The presence of those additional voices has direct impact going forward on the very nature of the museum as a public institution, not solely as a collections depot and temple of objects, but to invoke Secretary Adams' previously quoted words as, quote, a forum committed to the promulgation of not to the promulgation of received wisdom, but to the encouragement of a multicultural dialogue. We struggle in the 21st century and on a global basis to find and implement civic and social space, those gathering places for discussion, discourse, debate, even controversy, but always a forum and safe place for unsafe ideas concerning cultural history and human experience. Museums represent at least the opportunity to serve as a notable chink in that contemporary armor of political and social polarities and the disabling cultural and historical gloom they engender. The museum as counterpoint, although not able to do everything, can do something, and a very important something. And who knows what might possibly follow. True forums hold the potentiality of enhanced and stronger mutual understanding that can lead to mutual respect. And genuine mutual respect just might create the possibility of true and enduring social and cultural reconciliation. And God knows that the United States needs a bit more of that at the moment. That hope and aspiration should be the objective of all museums and how we define ourselves and our future in the 21st century, including this one. I close now, and in blessed relief from the rigors and analytics of contemporary museology, on the gentle and more soothing wings of a poem. It is brief and a longtime favorite of mine. And back when, I used it from time to time in concluding remarks like today's regarding the intentions of the National Museum of the American Indian. I return to it now not to bore you with repetition, but because for me, blessedly, nothing has changed. It remains as accurately descriptive of the spirit of the NMAI now as it was a decade and a half ago and more. The poem is entitled It Doesn't End, of course, and the words belong to Simon Ortiz of the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico. I believe Simon was speaking with poignancy and power to the centrality of his own native identity and culture. But he could have been speaking for most of us in this room, native or non-native, and perhaps also for the profound ethic and impact of this very special native place on the mall called the National Museum of the American Indian. Here are the words. It doesn't end, of course, in all growing, from all earths to all skies, in all touching all things, and soothing the aches of all years, it doesn't end. I thank you for your kind attention this morning, but today, most of all, I am deeply, deeply grateful for all that you had to do, Sister Suzan, with all of this, and may it ever be so. Thank you.